Let's talk about relative clauses. We are in your upper intermediate students book, Unit 8. And if you look at the language focus box on page 71 of your Headway upper intermediate book, the first part is on relative clauses. So this video will just be about the relative clause part. Relative clauses are like adjectives. They give us more information. Okay, so remember that clause is a group of words that includes a subject and a verb. Many sentences in English have only one clause, but there are also some that have two clauses, or even three or four or more. So we want to pay careful attention to a special kind of clause called a relative clause, and it acts like an adjective. So here's a good example. We have a German neighbor who comes from Munich. Now, of course, we have the adjective German before the noun neighbor, so we know that this neighbor is German. Here we have a relative clause that's telling us some more specific information, not just that he's from Germany, but where in Germany he's from. He's from the city of Munich. Now, read these sentences aloud, paying attention to the punctuation. Underline the relative clauses. We'll get to the underlining in a moment, but let me read these aloud for you. Listen carefully and pay attention. I met a man who's a pilot. My friend Adam, who lives in London, is a pilot. The house which you walked past is my aunt's. My aunt's house, which I don't like, is very modern. Okay, now let's underline those relative clauses. I met a man who's a pilot. My friend Adam, who lives in London, is a pilot. The house which you walked past is my aunt's. My aunt's house, which I don't like, is very modern. Okay, so these are our relative clauses. We have two pairs that kind of go together for purposes of teaching. Notice we have the word who here, or here the contraction whose for who is, and then which in these second two sentences. These are what we call relative pronouns. Relative pronouns introduce a relative clause. Now, let's look a little bit more carefully at these. In each pair of sentences, which relative clause tells us exactly who or what is being talked about? This kind is a defining relative clause. Okay? The relative clause, who's a pilot, tells us which man I met. Tells us exactly who I met. The house which you walked past is my aunt's. This tells us which house. This tells us we're not talking about the other houses that you didn't walk past. We're talking about the one that you walked past. Now, in each pair of sentences, which relative clause gives us an extra piece of information? This is a non-defining relative clause. So, who lives in London, right? That tells us more about my friend Adam. Notice we could also leave out this clause entirely. We could say, my friend Adam is a pilot. It would still be a good sentence. It would still tell us information. When we add who lives in London, this tells us even more. This gives us extra information. My aunt's house, which I don't like, is very modern. Okay, again, we could just say, my aunt's house is very modern. But in the middle of this main clause, we are inserting this non-defining relative clause, which tells us extra information about the house, in this case, my personal opinion of it. Now, explain the use of commas. How do they affect the pronunciation? Listen to the sentences again. My friend Adam, who lives in London, is a pilot. My aunt's house, which I don't like, is very modern. So when we are writing sentences that have non-defining relative clauses, we write a comma before the beginning of that non-defining relative clause, and if there is more to the sentence, then we also put a comma at the end, right? Commas in writing usually correspond to pauses in speaking, and when we're saying these sentences, naturally we pause just a little bit after Adam or after house, and then again at the end of the relative clause as well. So that comma corresponds to the pause that is naturally there in spoken English. That makes it a little bit easier for the listener or the reader to understand the sentence. 3. In which sentence in 1 can the relative pronoun be omitted? So we're looking back at the 4 example sentences from part 1 of this explanation. And the one where we can omit or leave out the relative pronoun is this sentence. The house which you walked past is my aunt's. Notice we have this relative pronoun which, and this is a defining relative clause. It tells us which house, exactly which house we're talking about. In a defining relative clause, when your relative pronoun, in this case it's which, when your relative pronoun is the object of the relative clause, then you can leave it out. Okay? So we can just say, the house you walked past is my aunt's. If you say it the longer way, the relative pronoun which is actually the object of past, which is a preposition here. You walked past my aunt's house. You walked past it. The house which you walked past is my aunt's. Okay? So in sentences like this, when you have a defining relative clause where the relative pronoun is or would be the object of that same clause, then you can leave it out. Of course, in spoken English, we naturally leave it out a lot. It's easier to do when you leave out a word. And listeners and speakers of English are accustomed to hearing sentences like this, so it's fine to leave it out. Also okay to include it. It's your choice. But you should know when you're reading and listening that often these will be omitted. I hope you find that very helpful.